The worst part wasn't what happened in front of hundreds of people. The worst part was realizing that nobody was going to stop it. The polished marble floor of Westbridge Plaza reflected the glow of 1,000 lights above me as I balanced a stack of folded sweaters in my arms. It was 3 days before Christmas, the busiest shopping weekend of the year, and every store in the mall seemed packed beyond capacity. Children laughed near the giant tree in the center atrium. Holiday music floated through hidden speakers. Everywhere I looked, people were smiling. I wished I could remember what that felt like. I was 26 years old, working my second shift of the day after covering for a coworker who had called in sick. My feet ached inside shoes that were a size too small, and my paycheck still wasn't going to cover next month's rent. But I kept smiling because retail taught you one thing very quickly. Nobody cared how tired you were as long as the shelves looked perfect. I adjusted a display near the entrance of the store and glanced at the clock. Only 2 more hours. 2 more hours and I could go home to my tiny apartment, heat up leftover soup, and pretend tomorrow would somehow be easier. That's when I heard someone call out, "Excuse me." The voice carried the sharp confidence of someone who is used to being obeyed immediately. I turned and found a woman standing beside a designer handbag display. She looked to be in her late 40s, dressed in clothing that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Diamond earrings sparkled beneath perfectly styled blonde hair. Her expression suggested that the entire world existed solely to inconvenience her. "Can I help you?" I asked politely. She held up a scarf. This was supposed to be gift-wrapped. I examined it carefully. The item had been taken directly from the shelf less than a minute ago. "I'd be happy to wrap it for you right now." Her eyes narrowed. I shouldn't have to ask. Around us, shoppers continued moving through the store. Nobody seemed to notice the tension building. I apologized and reached for the scarf. Instead of handing it over, she stepped closer. "Do you know how much money I spend in this mall every year?" I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. There was no correct response to that question. Experience had taught me that much. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," I said. The woman laughed softly. Not amused. Not happy. Just dismissive. The kind of laugh that reminded you exactly where you stood in the social hierarchy. "People don't want to work anymore," she announced loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear. A few heads turned. Heat rushed into my face. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to open beneath me. Instead, I stood there and listened as she continued listing everything she believed was wrong with me despite knowing absolutely nothing about my life. Then came the moment that stayed with me long after the holiday decorations were taken down. She brushed past me carelessly while gesturing toward the display. The folded sweaters slipped from my arms and scattered across the floor. Gasps sounded from nearby customers. My heart dropped into my stomach. For 1 second, the entire store felt silent. The woman shook her head dramatically. Unbelievable. Then she walked away. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said a word. I knelt on the marble floor and began gathering the sweaters with trembling hands. My eyes burned, but I refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers. Not again. What I didn't know was that somewhere far above the crowded mall, a security camera had captured every second of what happened. And a man who owned the entire building had just started watching the replay. I did not know his name that night. I did not know he owned the building, the stores, or the cameras that watched every hallway and entrance. All I knew was that my shift finally ended at 9 o'clock and I wanted to go home. The employee exit opened into a narrow service corridor behind the mall. The cheerful holiday music disappeared the moment the door closed behind me. Silence felt strangely comforting. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and started walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks away. The December air bit at my cheeks. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I already knew who it was before I looked. Ethan. 3 missed calls. 2 text messages. My stomach tightened instantly. The first message read, "Where are you?" The second came 3 minutes later. "Answer me." I slipped the phone back into my pocket without replying. The streetlights reflected off damp pavement as cars moved through the city. Around me, people hurried home carrying shopping bags and wrapped gifts. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere. Everyone except me. 20 minutes later, I reached my apartment building. The elevator was broken again, so I climbed 4 flights of stairs and unlocked the door to my tiny one-bedroom unit. The silence inside felt heavy. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter and stared at my reflection in the microwave door. Tired eyes. Tired face. Tired everything. I heated a can of soup and sat alone at the small table near the window. For a while, I almost convinced myself the day was over. Then my phone rang again. Ethan. I declined the call. Seconds later, another message appeared. We need to talk. I closed my eyes. Outside, a siren echoed somewhere in the distance. Inside, the radiator rattled like it was struggling to survive another winter. I wished I could say I felt safe there. The truth was more complicated. Meanwhile, 20 floors above Westbridge Plaza, another day was refusing to end. Damien Moretti sat alone in a conference room overlooking the city skyline. Most of the executives had already gone home. The cleaning crews were starting their rounds. Yet he remained seated at the long glass table, staring at one security monitor. The footage played again. And again. And again. A young retail employee gathering sweaters from the floor. Her hands shaking slightly. Her head lowered. The timestamp glowed in the corner of the screen. Damien leaned back in his chair. He had spent years building a reputation as a man who noticed details other people missed. That was why the replay bothered him. It was not the wealthy customer. It was not the argument. It was not even the embarrassment. It was the expression on the girl's face afterward. The look of someone already carrying too much long before that moment happened. The head of security entered quietly. You wanted the employee information? Damien nodded without taking his eyes off the screen. The man handed over a file. Claire Bennett, 26 years old. Part-time sales associate. Damien opened the folder. A simple employee photograph stared back at him. Blonde hair. Green eyes. Reserved smile. He studied the image for several seconds. Then he closed the file. Find out if she is coming to work tomorrow, he said calmly. The head of security hesitated. Is there a problem, sir? Damien looked once more at the frozen image on the monitor. Not yet, he replied. But I intend to find out why it feels like there is. The next morning began with exhaustion sitting on my chest like a weight I could not shake. I barely slept. Every time my phone lit up during the night, I felt my stomach twist. By 7:30, I was already standing behind the register at Westbridge Plaza, forcing myself through another shift. The holiday crowds had returned. Families filled the walkways. Coffee cups steamed in hurried hands. Life moved forward as if nothing had happened. Maybe that was the part that hurt the most. The world never stopped long enough to notice when someone was struggling. Around 10 o'clock, my manager appeared beside me. Claire, can I see you for a minute? My pulse immediately jumped. I followed her toward the back office, trying to think of every possible mistake I might have made. Had a customer complained? Was I being written up? Had I forgotten some inventory report? The office door closed behind us. My manager looked unusually nervous. Do not panic, she said, which instantly made me panic. Someone from corporate wants to meet with you. I stared at her. Corporate? She nodded. Very high up. The room suddenly felt smaller. Why? She hesitated. I honestly do not know. That answer did not help. 10 minutes later, I found myself sitting in a private elevator I had never used before. The mirrored walls reflected my anxious expression from every angle. My palms felt damp. My heart would not slow down. The elevator climbed higher and higher. Past the executive offices. Past floors employees rarely visited. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a hallway lined with dark wood and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Everything felt quiet. Expensive. Important. A man in a tailored suit approached. Miss Bennett. I nodded. This way, please. We stopped outside a pair of large glass doors. He opened them and stepped aside. I walked into a conference room bigger than my entire apartment. Sunlight poured through the windows. A long table stretched across the center of the room. At the far end sat a man reviewing documents. Dark suit. Dark hair. Calm posture. He did not immediately look up. Somehow that made him more intimidating. The silence seemed deliberate, controlled. Finally, he closed the folder in front of him and lifted his eyes. Blue-gray. Sharp. Observant. The kind of eyes that noticed everything. "Claire Bennett," he said. His voice was calm. "Please sit." I obeyed before my brain fully caught up. My pulse hammered in my ears. This had to be the owner. The man whose name appeared on every corporate memo. Damien Moretti. I had seen photographs before. None of them captured the presence he carried in person. He studied me for several seconds. Not rudely. Not aggressively. Just carefully. Like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. "No, sir." A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth. "Good. That means nobody has frightened you with rumors yet." Confusion replaced some of my anxiety. He reached for a remote control resting on the table. A screen behind him illuminated. Suddenly, I saw myself. The footage from yesterday. The display. The sweaters falling. The humiliation I had desperately wanted to forget. Heat rushed into my face. I wanted to disappear all over again. Damien watched the screen for a moment before looking back at me. "Tell me something, Claire." His voice remained calm. "Why did you apologize when you were the one being treated unfairly?" For a moment, I could not answer. The question sounded simple, but it landed somewhere deep inside me. I looked away from the screen and focused on the city beyond the glass windows. Tiny cars moved through the streets below. People rushed from one place to another. Nobody up there knew I was sitting across from one of the most powerful men in the city trying to explain something I barely understood myself. "Because that is what employees do," I finally said. "We apologize." Damien remained silent. I could feel him watching me. "Even when it is not your fault?" he asked. I shrugged. Especially then. A strange expression crossed his face. Not agreement. Not amusement. Something else. Something thoughtful. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "That is a terrible rule." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because nobody had ever said that before. Every manager I had ever worked for would have disagreed. Every difficult customer certainly would have disagreed. Yet somehow hearing him say it made me realize how unfair it sounded. Damien reached toward a small tray sitting nearby. "Coffee?" I blinked. "What?" "Coffee. Tea. Water. You look like you have not slept." Heat crept into my cheeks. "Water is fine." A few moments later, an assistant quietly entered and placed a glass in front of me before leaving again. The entire floor seemed to operate with silent precision. Nobody wasted words. Nobody questioned instructions. I wrapped my hands around the cool glass. Damien glanced toward the screen once more. "That customer has already been informed she is no longer welcome on any property owned by my company." My head snapped up. "You did not have to do that." "I know." His answer came immediately. "I wanted to." I stared at him. The confidence in his voice made it clear the decision had never been up for debate. He folded his hands together. "Claire, how long have you worked here?" "Almost 2 years." "And in those 2 years, has anyone ever spoken to you the way she did?" I hesitated. That hesitation answered the question before I ever opened my mouth. Damien noticed. Of course he noticed. His eyes missed very little. "I see." The room fell quiet again. I suddenly became aware of how exhausted I felt. The kind of exhaustion that settled into your bones after carrying stress for too long. Damien seemed to notice that too. His gaze dropped briefly to my hands resting around the glass. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. "What happened to your wrist?" My stomach tightened instantly. I lowered my sleeve without thinking. The motion was automatic. Defensive. A habit I had developed months ago. "Nothing." The answer came too quickly. Damien did not challenge me. Somehow that made me even more nervous. Most people pushed when they sensed weakness. He simply watched. Calm. Patient. Waiting. "Claire," he said quietly, "you do not have to answer if you do not want to." The gentleness in his voice caught me off guard. I looked down at the table. At the reflection of sunlight across polished glass. At anything except him. "I bumped into something," I said. The lie sounded weak even to my own ears. Damien remained silent for several seconds. Then he nodded once. Understood. He did not believe me. I knew he did not. Yet he let the subject drop. For now, a strange feeling settled over me as I sat there. Relief mixed with uncertainty. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone had looked directly at the cracks in my life and chosen not to look away. And somehow that frightened me more than anything else. When the meeting finally ended, I expected to feel relieved. Instead, I felt unsettled in a way I could not explain. Damien stood as I gathered my things. Thank you for your time, Claire. I nodded awkwardly. Thank you for the water. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. You're welcome. It was such a normal exchange. Such an ordinary conversation. Yet as I stepped back into the elevator, my heart was beating harder than it should have been. The ride down felt longer than before. By the time the doors opened onto the retail level, I had almost convinced myself the entire meeting had been nothing more than a strange interruption in my day. Then I returned to work. The first thing I noticed was how differently people were looking at me. Not everyone. Just enough to make me uncomfortable. My manager appeared almost immediately. Everything okay? She asked carefully. I think so. She stared at me for a moment. You were upstairs for nearly an hour. I had not realized it had been that long. We just talked. She looked unconvinced, but wisely did not ask more questions. The afternoon passed slowly. I folded clothes, helped customers, restocked displays, tried very hard not to think about Damien Moretti. Unfortunately, my brain refused to cooperate. Every time I remembered the way he had watched that security footage, another question appeared. Why had he cared? Why spend time on a retail employee he had never met? Why ask about my life? None of it made sense. Around 6 o'clock, my phone buzzed again. Ethan. I ignored it. 30 seconds later it buzzed again. Then again. And again. My chest tightened. Finally, a message appeared. We're having dinner tonight. Do not make me wait. I stared at the screen. The words felt less like an invitation and more like an order. A familiar knot formed in my stomach. One I had been carrying for months. Maybe longer. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned to helping a customer choose a winter coat. Smile. Nod. Pretend everything was fine. By closing time, I felt completely drained. Outside, snow had started falling. Soft white flakes drifted beneath the glow of the parking lot lights. The city looked quieter. Almost peaceful. I was halfway to the employee exit when I heard someone call my name. Claire. I turned. One of the security supervisors approached. There is a package for you. Confusion washed over me. A package? He handed over a small shopping bag from one of the luxury stores inside the mall. This was left at the executive office. My pulse immediately quickened. I looked inside. A soft cashmere scarf rested neatly folded at the bottom. Gray. Elegant. Simple. Attached was a small card. No signature. No explanation. Just 6 words written in clean black ink. No employee should leave cold. I stared at the message while snowflakes landed softly on the paper. Somewhere high above the shopping center, office lights still glowed behind dark glass windows. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Damien Moretti had noticed far more about me than he was willing to say. The scarf sat on my kitchen table all night. I told myself I should return it. I told myself accepting gifts from the owner of the company where I worked was a terrible idea. Yet every time I looked at the small handwritten note, I felt something unfamiliar. Not obligation. Not fear. Consideration. Someone had noticed I was cold. It seemed like such a small thing until I realized how long it had been since anyone noticed anything about me at all. The next evening, reality returned with perfect timing. My shift ended at 8. Snow covered the sidewalks outside Westbridge Plaza, turning the city streets silver beneath the streetlights. I wrapped the scarf around my neck before leaving. The cashmere felt warm against my skin. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to enjoy that warmth. Then I saw Ethan waiting beside his car. My stomach dropped immediately. His hands were shoved into the pockets of his jacket. His expression was impossible to read from across the parking lot. There you are, he said when I approached. I have been calling. I tightened my grip on my bag. I have been working. His eyes moved to the scarf around my neck. That is new. The simple observation somehow felt like an accusation. A gift from work, I replied carefully. Silence stretched between us. Snowflakes drifted through the cold air. Cars moved in and out of the parking garage entrance nearby. Ethan's jaw tightened. You have been acting different lately. I have been tired lately. Same thing. I looked away. Arguing never solved anything. It only made every conversation longer. Let us just go home, I said quietly. Instead of moving toward the car, Ethan stepped closer. Who gave you the scarf? My pulse quickened. Why does it matter? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Immediately, I regretted it. His expression hardened. It matters because I asked. I stared at the snowy pavement. Around us, people walked past carrying shopping bags and cups of coffee. Nobody paid attention. Nobody ever did. It was from corporate, I answered. Someone from corporate. Technically true. Ethan seemed unconvinced. The tension between us grew heavier. Then something unexpected happened. A black SUV rolled slowly toward the curb 20 yards away. Expensive. Immaculate. The kind of vehicle that belonged in executive parking garages, not employee lots. The rear passenger window lowered slightly. I barely noticed at first. Ethan did. His attention shifted instantly toward the vehicle. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the SUV continued forward and disappeared into traffic. Strange. Unimportant. At least that was what I thought. Ethan watched until the taillights vanished. Who was that? He asked. How would I know? His eyes returned to me. Suspicion lingered there. Something uncomfortable settled in my chest. Because for the first time, I realized my life and Damian Moretti's world were beginning to cross paths in ways neither of us could completely control. And somewhere in the city, a man who missed very little had just witnessed far more than I wanted him to see. The following afternoon, the sky hung low over the city, heavy with gray clouds that threatened more snow. I spent most of my shift trying to focus on work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the parking lot. Back to the black SUV. Back to the expression on Ethan's face after it disappeared. Something had changed. I could feel it. The problem was that I did not know what. Around 4 o'clock, my manager asked me to reorganize a display near the center atrium. The area was crowded with holiday shoppers. Children posed for photographs beside towering decorations. Music drifted through the air. Everything looked cheerful. Everything looked normal. Then I saw Ethan. My heart immediately sank. He was standing near the entrance of the store. Watching. He was not supposed to be there. He knew I was working. He knew I could not leave. Yet there he stood with his hands in his pockets and tension written across his face. I tried to ignore him. For nearly 20 minutes, I focused on folding merchandise and helping customers. Eventually, he walked inside. Can we talk? He asked. I am working. It will take a minute. I glanced around nervously. Not here. His jaw tightened. You have been avoiding me. A customer approached the register, giving me a temporary escape. I helped complete the transaction and hoped Ethan would leave. He did not. He waited. The pressure of his attention followed me through the store. By the time my break finally arrived, I felt exhausted. I stepped into a quieter hallway behind the retail floor. Ethan followed. The moment the door closed behind us, the tension became impossible to ignore. Who is he? He asked. Who? The man in the SUV. I stared at him. I do not know. I do not believe that. Frustration flared inside me. You are asking questions I cannot answer. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. Claire, ever since that meeting upstairs, everything feels different. I folded my arms tightly. Because you are making it different. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us. Then a calm voice interrupted from behind. Is there a problem here? Ethan and I both turned. Damian Moretti stood at the far end of the hallway. Dark suit. Controlled expression. Hands relaxed at his sides. He did not look angry. He did not look threatening. Somehow that made his presence even more powerful. Ethan straightened immediately. No problem. Damien's blue-gray eyes moved briefly between us, taking in every detail. Missing nothing. Good, he said calmly. Because employees deserve to feel comfortable while they are at work. The statement sounded simple, professional, reasonable. Yet, something beneath it carried unmistakable weight. Ethan nodded quickly. Of course. Damien held his gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. Then I am sure you understand why this conversation should end. Silence filled the hallway. Ethan looked as though he wanted to argue. Instead, he glanced away. Right. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. I watched him disappear around the corner. My pulse hammered inside my chest. Damien remained where he was. Calm. Unmoved. As though he had merely stopped to comment on the weather. Finally, he looked at me. Are you all right, Claire? Nobody had asked me that question in a very long time and genuinely seemed to care about the answer. For the first time, I was not entirely sure how to respond. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring at him. The hallway felt unusually quiet after Ethan left. The distant sounds of holiday shoppers drifted through the walls, muted and far away. Damien waited patiently. He did not rush me. He did not fill the silence. Somehow that made answering even harder. I am fine, I said automatically. The words came out before I could stop them. They were the same words I always used. The same shield. The same lie. Damien tilted his head slightly. You do not sound convinced. A nervous laugh escaped me. That is because I am not very good at lying. To my surprise, a faint smile appeared on his face. Not the polite smile executives used during meetings. A real one. Brief. Genuine. Then it disappeared. No, he said quietly. You are actually very good at it. Which concerns me. My chest tightened. He understood more than he should have. More than I wanted him to. Before I could respond, my break timer buzzed on my phone. Relief washed over me. An escape. I should get back to work. Damien nodded. Of course. I started walking toward the sales floor. Then his voice stopped me. Claire. I turned. You do not owe anyone an explanation for protecting your peace. The words caught me completely off guard. I stared at him for a moment before quietly saying, thank you. Then I left. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Yet his words followed me everywhere. While folding sweaters. While helping customers. While reorganizing displays. You do not owe anyone an explanation. Nobody had ever said something like that to me before. Not my parents. Not Ethan. Not anyone. For years, I had felt responsible for everyone else's emotions. Responsible for keeping situations calm. Responsible for making sure nobody became upset. The idea that I was allowed to choose peace felt almost revolutionary. 3 days later, another surprise arrived. Not a gift. Not a package. An invitation. My manager approached during lunch carrying a small envelope. Executive holiday reception, she explained. Employees from every department were selected through a recognition program. I opened the card carefully. The event would be held on the top floor of Westbridge Plaza the following Saturday evening. Food. Music. Awards. Networking. Everything about it sounded intimidating. I think there has been a mistake, I said. My manager laughed. There has not. By Saturday night, I almost talked myself out of going. My apartment floor was covered with rejected outfits. Nothing looked right. Nothing felt right. Eventually, I settled on a simple navy blue dress and arrived feeling completely out of place. The reception occupied the same executive floor where I had first met Damien. Crystal lights reflected across enormous windows overlooking the city skyline. Employees mingled in small groups. Laughter echoed through the room. I stood near a window, clutching a glass of sparkling water and wondering how soon I could politely leave. Then I felt someone step beside me. You look uncomfortable. I glanced up. Damien. My heart immediately betrayed me by beating faster. I am uncomfortable. He looked around the crowded room. Interesting. Why? Because everyone else seems terrified of speaking to me. I blinked. Then, unexpectedly, I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in weeks. Damien looked genuinely pleased by that reaction. For a moment, Neither of us spoke. We simply stood together watching snow drift beyond the glass. Finally, I said something that surprised even me. You know, you could probably use fewer people being afraid of you. Damien looked out at the city lights below. Then he smiled slightly and said, "You may be the first person brave enough to tell me that." 3 months later, spring sunlight spilled across the glass walls of Westbridge Plaza. The giant holiday decorations were long gone. The crowds were different. The season was different. Somehow, so was I. I stood on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city, holding a cup of coffee and watching the morning traffic move through the streets below. The wind carried the scent of rain and fresh pavement. For the first time in years, I felt calm. Truly calm. Life had not transformed overnight. There had been difficult conversations, hard decisions, changes that felt impossible until they became necessary. Ethan was no longer part of my life. Walking away had been terrifying. Yet looking back, I realized something important. Peace often feels frightening when you have spent too long surviving chaos. Behind me, the terrace door opened. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. "You are early," Damien said. I smiled into my coffee. "You are later than usual." He stepped beside me and looked out across the skyline. His suit jacket moved slightly in the breeze. Everything about him still carried the quiet authority that had intimidated me the first day we met. Yet now I also knew the man beneath it. The man who stayed late to review employee concerns. The man who secretly funded scholarships for workers trying to finish school. The man who noticed when people were hurting and rarely took credit for helping. "The board meeting ran long," he said. "That sounds terrible." It was. I laughed softly. Months ago, I never would have imagined standing here joking with Damien Moretti. The distance between our worlds had seemed impossible. Yet somehow we had met in the middle. Not because he changed who I was. Not because I changed who he was. Because we reminded each other of things that mattered. He taught me that my voice deserved to be heard. I taught him that not every problem could be solved with power. Sometimes people simply needed kindness. Damien rested his arms on the railing. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked quietly. I knew exactly which day he meant. The crowded store. The humiliation. The moment a security camera captured a retail employee trying not to cry in public. Sometimes, I admitted. Mostly because it feels like it happened to a different person. He nodded slowly. "It changed more than you know." I looked at him. "How?" Damien was silent for a moment. Then he smiled. "I spent years building buildings, companies, investments. I thought leadership meant controlling outcomes." His eyes moved across the city below. Then one afternoon, I watched a young woman pick sweaters up off a floor while everyone around her looked away. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Damien met my gaze. That was the day I remembered why people matter more than any business ever will. Emotion settled quietly between us. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just honest. The kind of feeling that stays long after words disappear. Far below, thousands of people moved through the shopping center, beginning another ordinary day. Most would never know how much one small moment had changed two lives. Damien offered me his hand. I took it without hesitation. Together we looked out across the city we had both learned to see differently. He owned the building. But in the end, that was never the reason I stayed. I stayed because he saw me when nobody else did. And sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away.